Russia's Baltic oil machine just took one of its hardest hits of the war, not on the front line, not in Crimea, deep in the Baltic at Primorsk, one of Moscow's most important export terminals, where Ukrainian strikes triggered fires, halted loadings, and exposed a vulnerability the Kremlin has spent years pretending did not exist. According to Reuters, subsequent attacks on Primorsk, Ust-Luga, and other export routes helped knock out roughly 40% of Russia's oil export capacity, at least temporarily. And that matters because oil revenue is still one of the engines funding this war. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Ukraine did not need to destroy the whole port to create a strategic shock. It only needed to prove Russia's Baltic lifeline can burn. What happened at Primorsk changes the conversation. Ukraine struck a major oil terminal in Russia's Leningrad region, and the effect was immediate enough that loadings at Primorsk were suspended. Reuters reported that several fuel reservoirs were set ablaze, while Ukraine's general staff said the strike also hit oil loading infrastructure. Primorsk is not some decorative civilian pier on the edge of the map. It is a major Baltic outlet for Russia's Urals crude and diesel, capable of exporting more than 1 million barrels per day. And here's the critical point. The strategic claim is not that Ukraine erased Primorsk from existence overnight. The real claim is more serious. Ukraine proved it can repeatedly interrupt one of Russia's most valuable maritime export nodes at will. According to Reuters, Primorsk remained shut even after neighboring Ust-Luga resumed some loadings. That asymmetry tells you the damage at Primorsk was not trivial. If a terminal handling flagship exports suddenly stops moving product, that is not just a fire. That is pressure on cash flow, logistics, insurance, shipping schedules, and Kremlin nerves. Now add the mini case study. The governor of Leningrad region publicly acknowledged a fuel tank fire. Russian officials, as usual, kept the wording carefully minimal because understatement is cheaper than honesty. But Ukrainian officials said both a tank and loading infrastructure were hit, and reporting cited satellite imagery suggesting multiple tanks were burning. That gap matters. Russia wanted this to sound like an isolated incident. The imagery suggested a much uglier reality. A major export terminal briefly turned into a visible industrial bonfire on the Gulf of Finland. But this is only the beginning, because Primorsk by itself is damaging. Primorsk plus Ust-Luga plus pressure on other routes becomes something else entirely, a campaign. Now we're at the critical juncture. Primorsk matters because the Baltic is not just geography for Russia. It is revenue, sanctions evasion, and strategic theatre rolled into one. Reuters reported that Primorsk and Ust-Luga are Russia's largest Western petroleum export outlets. Ust-Luga handles around 700,000 barrels per day, while Primorsk can export more than 1 million barrels per day. Together, they are not peripheral assets, they are major valves in the Kremlin's financial circulatory system. And then there's the shadow fleet. Britain estimates that about 3/4 of Russia's crude oil is transported by these opaque, sanctions-dodging vessels. Prime Minister Keir Starmer said Europe should go after the shadow fleet even harder, and Reuters noted that Britain alone has sanctioned 544 such vessels. This is where the Baltic becomes more than a shipping lane. It becomes a grey zone battle space, part oil corridor, part sanctions loophole, part maritime intimidation campaign. The International Institute for Strategic Studies goes even further. ISS says European states are shifting from symbolic gestures to actual enforcement against Russian-linked vessels, especially in contested waters like the Baltic and North Sea. Why? Because the shadow fleet is not just about commerce. It brings environmental risk, false flags, AIS manipulation, insurance irregularities, and a constant escalation game just short of open confrontation. In other words, Moscow built a sanctions-evading maritime ecosystem in the Baltic. Ukraine just reminded everyone that ecosystems burn too. Here's the irony. Russia hates. The Kremlin wanted the Baltic to project resilience. Instead, it now projects dependence. The more oil, tankers, terminals, and shadow fleet traffic Moscow concentrates through this zone, the more tempting the zone becomes as a Ukrainian target set. That brings us to the real problem Putin is facing. Not whether one port can be repaired, but whether repeated strikes can turn the Baltic from an asset into a liability. Here's what most analysts are missing. The strongest evidence is not the fire itself. It is the cumulative export disruption. Reuters calculated that after strikes on Primorsk, Ust-Luga, pressure on Novorossiysk, disruption to the Druzhba pipeline, and tanker seizures, At least 40% of Russia's oil export capacity, about 2 million barrels per day, was halted. Reuters called it the most severe oil supply disruption in modern Russian history. That is the number that explains everything. Not because every barrel disappears forever, but because the Kremlin cannot wage an expensive attritional war while treating export choke points as optional. ISAW drew the strategic line clearly. It assessed that Ukrainian drone strikes on Primorsk and Ust-Luga, combined with Western moves against tankers, are degrading Russia's ability to transport and sell oil, and therefore its ability to fund military operations. Russia still has eastern routes. Reuters notes that exports to Asian markets and pipelines to China continue, totaling around 1.9 million barrels per day, with additional Sakhalin and Belarus-related flows. But that is exactly the problem for Moscow. When westward routes are under pressure, rerouting capacity is finite, slower, and less flexible than the Kremlin would like to advertise. Then comes the human element and the warning. Energy analyst Boris Aronstein told Current Time in comments cited by RFE/RL that this is the most serious threat to exports of Russian oil and oil products since the war began. CREA analyst Isaac Levy added that repeated Ukrainian strikes are deliberately slowing recovery timelines by hitting sites during repairs or restarts. That matters because it closes the loop from the hook. Ukraine does not need one cinematic knockout blow. It needs recurring operational pain. A port that keeps reopening and then closing is almost worse than a port that dies cleanly because it poisons planning, contracts, schedules, and confidence. The bigger strategic logic comes from the Baker Institute, which describes these attacks as kinetic sanctions. Legal sanctions can be dodged with shell companies' forged paperwork and elderly tankers that should have been scrapped years ago. A drone strike is much less interested in paperwork. Physical damage to depots, refineries, loading stands, and transfer nodes is slower and more expensive to reverse. That is why these attacks matter beyond the flames on screen. They are designed to disconnect revenue from warfighting capacity. By the way, if you're finding this analysis valuable, subscribe to the Military Show. We break down these developments daily, but the consequences go even further. Because once Europe sees that Ukrainian strikes and maritime enforcement can squeeze the same system at the same time, the pressure on Russia's Baltic model becomes exponentially harder to manage. So what does this mean for Putin over the next 30 to 90 days? First, expect hardening, dispersal, and deception. Russia will try to shield storage, reroute flows, thicken air defenses, and present every new fire as a minor inconvenience, plus some heroic air defense statistic. It will also lean harder on eastern routes and on the shadow fleet. But every one of those fixes carries cost, friction, or both. And friction is deadly in wartime logistics. Second, expect a tighter collision between Ukraine's deep strike campaign and Europe's shadow fleet enforcement. Reuters reported that British forces are now authorized to board and detain Russian shadow fleet vessels in British waters, while I2ISS documented an increasingly assertive posture by European coastal states. That means Moscow is facing a two-level problem. Ukrainian strikes can damage the export infrastructure, and European enforcement can complicate the shipping ecosystem that moves the barrels. One hits the terminal, the other stalks the tanker. Third, and this may be the most important, expect Ukraine to keep choosing targets that impose asymmetric economic pain. Reuters notes oil and gas revenues account for roughly a quarter of Russia's state budget proceeds. That does not mean every strike instantly starves the Russian military. War economies are uglier and stickier than that, but it does mean sustained pressure on energy exports can force painful trade-offs, less flexibility in spending, higher protection costs, more repair burdens, and more pressure on a system already trying to finance occupation, mobilization, and industrial attrition all at once. And this could get worse for Russia if the pattern holds. Remember what I said at the beginning. Ukraine did not need to vaporize Primorsk to mark a turning point. It only needed to show that Russia's Baltic export lifeline is reachable, repeatably disruptible, and strategically entangled with the shadow fleet Europe is now moving against. Once that message lands, every tanker queue, every insurance check, every restart announcement, and every black plume over the Gulf of Finland starts to look less like an accident and more like a warning. So here's what this all means. Ukraine has shown it can threaten one of the Kremlin's most sensitive pressure points, the maritime oil system that helps finance Russia's war. Primorsk was not just a fire, it was a demonstration that the Baltic, a zone Moscow uses for exports, sanctions evasion and intimidation, is also a zone of vulnerability. In the coming weeks, watch for three things: repeat strikes on export infrastructure, more aggressive European action against the shadow fleet, and Russian attempts to reroute east while pretending nothing fundamental has changed. If you want to understand how Ukraine is turning long-range strikes into economic warfare, the next video should be on its broader deep strike campaign against refineries, pipelines, and military industry. And if you want daily coverage of these developments, subscribe to The Military Show. We're tracking every move in this war.